I once met a man in Philadelphia who could not stop talking. Every thought that entered his mind came tumbling out of his mouth like water from a broken dam. He told me his opinions on politics, on religion, on his neighbors, on the price of bread, on everything under the sun. And when he finally paused to take a breath, I asked him a simple question: when do you listen? He looked at me as though I had spoken in a foreign tongue. He had no answer. Because in all his noise, he had forgotten how. That was 50 years ago, and I see that same man everywhere now. In the taverns, in the streets, in the halls of power. The world has become so loud, my friend, that most people have forgotten what silence sounds like. They fill every moment with chatter, with distraction, with the desperate need to be heard. They mistake noise for substance, volume for wisdom, and constant talking for strength. But let me tell you something I learned in my 70 years of walking this earth. The truly powerful men I have known, the ones who shaped nations and changed the course of history, they all shared one uncommon quality. They were silent inside. Not quiet in their impact, mind you. Silent in their inner world. While everyone else was drowning in mental chaos, these men had cultivated an inner stillness so profound that they could hear what others could not. They could think when others panicked. They could see clearly when others were blinded by emotion. Today, I want to show you why the noise in your head is costing you everything, and how learning to become silent inside will give you a power that most people will never understand. This is not about meditation or sitting cross-legged on a mountaintop. This is about becoming dangerous in the best possible way. Dangerous because you cannot be manipulated. Dangerous because you cannot be rushed into foolish decisions. Dangerous because while everyone else is reacting, you are responding with precision. Stay with me. Because what I am about to share will change not just how you think, but who you become. Let me tell you about a moment that changed everything for me. I was standing in front of King Louis XVI of France, negotiating an alliance that would determine whether America lived or died. The room was filled with advisors, nobles, men of power who had spent their entire lives in palaces while I had spent mine in print shops and laboratories. They expected me to beg, to plead for their help like a desperate colonial with his hat in his hand. Instead, I waited. I listened. I observed their body language, their glances at each other, and the subtle ways they tested me with loaded questions. And I said very little. One advisor grew impatient. "Monsieur Franklin, surely you have much to say about your rebellion." I smiled and replied simply, "I have found that the less I speak, the more others reveal what they truly think." The room went silent. In that silence, I learned more about French politics in 5 minutes than I could have in 5 hours of talking. I discovered who truly supported us, who was skeptical, and who might be turned to our cause. That restraint, that willingness to be comfortable in silence, secured millions in aid and changed the course of history. You see, while everyone else was performing, I was learning. While they were filling the air with words, I was reading the room like a book. This is what authentic power looks like. Not the loudest voice, but the most observant mind. Now, I know what you are thinking. "Benjamin, this sounds wonderful, but I live in a world that demands instant responses. My boss expects immediate answers. Social media moves at light speed. How can I possibly practice this kind of restraint?" And this is precisely why you must. The faster the world moves, the more valuable the person who refuses to be swept along by its current. Think of yourself as a large boulder in a rushing stream. The water flows around you, constantly moving, changing direction, but you remain steady, unmoved by every fluctuation. This steadiness, my friends, was one of my most valuable assets during the Revolution. When others panicked at British advances, when delegates argued about whether independence was even possible, I remained the boulder. Not because I was without doubt I had plenty, but because I understood that panic serves no useful purpose. I remember sitting in that hot Philadelphia room in 1776, listening to heated debates about the Declaration. Some wanted to wait. Others wanted to strike immediately. The temperature in that room, both literal and figurative, was unbearable. Yet someone had to remain calm enough to think clearly, to see beyond the immediate emotion. That someone was me, more often than not. But here's what I learned that might surprise you. Remaining calm doesn't mean suppressing emotion. It means choosing when and how to express it. I felt frustration. I felt fear. I felt anger at the injustice. But I didn't let those feelings dictate my actions in the moment they arose. There's a technique I developed that served me well. When I felt my blood beginning to boil, and believe me, dealing with the French court would test anyone's patience, I would excuse myself if possible. I'd step away, even if just for a moment. If I couldn't leave, I'd count slowly in my head while maintaining a pleasant expression. This small gap between stimulus and response is where wisdom lives. It's where poor Benjamin becomes wise Benjamin. It's where you transform from reactive to proactive. Think of it this way. When someone insults you, you have perhaps 3 seconds before your response becomes automatic. In those 3 seconds lies your power. You can choose to match their energy and escalate, or you can choose something else entirely. I often choose humor. When critics attacked me viciously in print, I sometimes responded with satire so gentle they didn't realize they'd been answered until days later. Other times I chose silence, which, I discovered, unsettles opponents far more than any angry retort. The stream keeps rushing. The boulder remains. This principle applies to everything: political disputes, business negotiations, and family disagreements. The person who maintains composure holds a tremendous advantage, not because they're unfeeling, but because they've mastered their feelings rather than being mastered by them. I learned this lesson the hard way during my years in France as America's diplomat. Picture this. I'm sitting across from French ministers who held our nation's fate in their hands. We desperately needed their military support, their naval power, their financial backing. Without France, the revolution would likely fail. These weren't simple negotiations. The French court was a theater of elaborate rituals, veiled insults, and power games that had been refined over centuries. Ministers would make us wait for weeks, testing our desperation. They'd hint at support, then withdraw. They'd demand concessions that would cripple our sovereignty before we'd even won it. Every instinct screamed at me to react, to pound the table, to threaten, to plead. I watched other diplomats do exactly that, and I watched them fail spectacularly. The French interpreted emotional displays as weakness, as evidence that they held all the cards. The more desperate you appeared, the worse your terms became. So I did something that bewildered my colleagues. I became perfectly patient. When ministers made us wait, I used the time to befriend their staff, to learn their gossip, to understand their internal politics. When they withdrew offers, I smiled and discussed philosophy instead. When they demanded unreasonable terms, I acknowledged their position without agreeing, then quietly pivoted to what they actually needed from us. This wasn't passivity. It was strategic patience. Behind my calm exterior, I was constantly observing, calculating, and adapting. I studied which ministers had the king's ear, who was feuding with whom, and what their personal ambitions were. I learned that the foreign minister hated the finance minister, and that both feared being outmaneuvered by court rivals. The breakthrough came not through force but through understanding. I realized the French ministers needed to look wise to their king, not charitable. So I reframed our request not as America begging for help, but as France seizing a historic opportunity to weaken Britain, their longtime enemy. I made supporting us look like a brilliant strategy rather than risky generosity. The result? A treaty of alliance worth millions. Not because I begged harder, but because I understood what they truly valued. This is the secret most people never learn. Influence isn't about changing what people want. It's about showing them how what you offer connects to what they already desire. Think about the last time someone tried to convince you of something. If they spent the whole time talking about what times they needed, how did that feel? Probably exhausting, maybe even irritating. But when someone shows genuine interest in your challenges, your goals, your world, suddenly, you're leaning in, you're listening. That's not manipulation, that's wisdom. I see this playing out everywhere in modern life. A job candidate who only talks about why they need the position rarely gets hired. But the one who demonstrates how their skills solve the company's specific problems? That person becomes invaluable. A salesperson who lists product features puts people to sleep, but one who asks questions, listens deeply, and then shows how this solution addresses that exact pain point. They build lasting relationships. The pattern is universal because human nature is universal. Here's what I learned through decades of negotiation, both in business and diplomacy. People are not convinced by your arguments. They're convinced by their own. Your job isn't to win a debate. It's to help them discover, through their own reasoning, that what you're proposing serves their interests. This requires patience. It requires genuine curiosity about how others think. It requires setting aside your ego long enough to truly understand their perspective. I remember countless evenings in Parisian salons, biting my tongue when someone said something I knew was wrong. But I'd learned that correcting people rarely changes minds, it only hardens positions. Instead, I'd ask questions. Gentle, curious questions that led them to reconsider their own assumptions. That's a fascinating point, I'd say. How do you think that would work if we consider this other factor? And I'd watch as they talk themselves into seeing the situation differently. This is the art of leading without pushing, of influencing without demanding, of winning people over by letting them convince themselves. I learned this through countless negotiations in the halls of power. When I needed France's support during the revolution, I didn't storm into Versailles demanding armies and gold. I asked questions. I listened to their concerns about Britain's growing dominance. I let them discover for themselves how supporting America served their own interests. The same principle applies in your daily life. When your teenager resists a curfew, don't just impose it. Ask them what they think is reasonable. Guide the conversation with questions. What time do you think keeps you safe? What would you do if you were the parent? More often than not, they'll arrive at something close to what you wanted, and they'll defend it because it's now their times idea. I call this the invisible hand of persuasion. It requires patience, yes. It demands you surrender the immediate satisfaction of telling someone they're wrong, but the rewards are extraordinary. People don't resent decisions they believe they made themselves. Here's the uncomfortable truth about human nature that took me decades to fully accept. We are all, to varying degrees, creatures of pride. We don't want to be taught. We want to discover. We don't want to be corrected. We want to arrive at the truth independently. The wise persuader understands this and works with it rather than against it. Think of yourself as a guide, not a commander. You're not dragging people to your destination. You're illuminating a path and letting them choose to walk it. The destination remains the same, but the journey transforms from coercion into collaboration. This is why I always carried questions in my pocket instead of proclamations. What do you make of this situation? Have you considered this angle? I wonder if there's another way to look at it. These simple phrases opened minds that direct contradiction would have sealed shut. The most skilled persuaders I've known, and I've observed hundreds across my lifetime, all shared this quality. They made others feel intelligent for changing their minds. They framed new ideas as revelations, not corrections. They celebrated when someone shifted position, never saying, "I told you so," but rather, "What brilliant reasoning brought you to that conclusion?" They understood something profound. People don't resist new information, they resist the feeling of being wrong. The sting isn't in the correction. It's in the humiliation that so often accompanies it. I saw this mastery in a Philadelphia merchant named Isaac, who transformed his failing business through one simple change. He stopped telling customers they were mistaken about prices or products. Instead, when someone misremembered a cost, he'd say, "Ah, you might be thinking of last season's rate, perfectly reasonable. Here's what we're offering now." When they confused one item for another, he'd respond, "I can see why you'd associate those, they're remarkably similar. Let me show you the distinction." Within months, his shop became the most trusted in the district. Not because his prices were lower or his goods superior, but because customers never left feeling foolish. They left feeling informed, respected, and valued. They returned, not despite their mistakes, but because of how gracefully those mistakes were handled. This is the art of correction without humiliation. You acknowledge the logic behind someone's error before presenting the truth. You find the thread of reasonableness in their misunderstanding and tug on it gently until they see the fuller picture themselves. The manipulable, by contrast, wield correction like a cudgel. "You're wrong," they announce triumphantly, as if catching an error makes them somehow superior. They treat every mistake as a moral failing rather than a natural step in the learning process. They create an environment where people would rather cling to error than face the shame of admission. I learned this lesson painfully in my youth. During a debate about colonial taxation, I publicly demolished a merchant's flawed argument with pure logic and irrefutable facts. I won the argument completely. I also made an enemy who spent the next 5 years undermining every proposal I made, regardless of its merit. The facts were on my side, yes, but I had ignored a greater truth. A man convinced against his will agrees still, and now he's also your adversary. That lesson cost me dearly, but it taught me something invaluable. Winning the argument is not the same as winning the person. And if you wish to accomplish anything of substance in this world, you need people, not defeated opponents nursing their wounded pride. So, I began a different approach. When someone stated an obvious error, instead of launching into correction, I'd say, "That may well be so, but have you considered?" Or I imagine in most cases you'd be right, though I wonder if. It felt unnatural at first, almost dishonest. My younger self would have called it cowardly. But I discovered something remarkable. People listened. The same men who had bristled at my contradictions now leaned in with interest. The same arguments that once fell on hostile ears were suddenly received as worthy of consideration. Nothing had changed except my delivery, yet everything changed in response. I trained myself to abandon certain words entirely. Certainly, undoubtedly, and obviously, disappeared from my vocabulary. These words don't strengthen your position, they fortify your opponent's defenses. Instead, I'd say, "I conceive, I apprehend," or "it appears to me." Such small adjustments, yet they transformed my ability to persuade. Within a year, I became one of the most effective members of the junto. My opinions carried weight not because I'd grown smarter, I was sharing the same insights I always had, but because I'd stopped making every conversation a battle where someone must lose. I gave people room to arrive at the truth alongside me, rather than forcing them to admit I'd arrived there first. This wasn't manipulation, it was respect. It was acknowledging that the human heart resists compulsion but opens to invitation. You can drag a man to wisdom, and he'll resent both you and the lesson. Or you can walk beside him until he discovers it himself, and he'll thank you for the company. The irony wasn't lost on me. By becoming less certain in my expression, I became more certain of my influence. I tested this principle rigorously in the junto, that little club of tradesmen and thinkers I'd gathered in Philadelphia. Every Friday night, we'd meet above a tavern on Grape Street, the air thick with tobacco smoke and possibility. These weren't educated men by society's standards, a cobbler, a printer, a surveyor, a clerk. But they had something far more valuable than Latin credentials. They were curious. At first, I'd come to these meetings armed with pronouncements. I'd read more books than anyone in that room, traveled further, and corresponded with minds across the ocean. Surely my role was to enlighten them, to deliver wisdom like a merchant delivers goods. The meetings were cordial enough, but something was missing. I could see it in their eyes, a certain guardedness, a holding back. They'd nod at my declarations, but they wouldn't build upon them. Then, I tried something different. Instead of arriving with answers, I arrived with questions. Real ones. Not the rhetorical kind that are just lectures in disguise. What makes a government legitimate? I might ask. Or, can paper currency truly represent value? And then, and this was the hardest part, I'd shut my mouth and listen. The transformation was extraordinary. The cobbler, whom I'd assumed had nothing to contribute to discussions of currency, offered an insight about trust that I'd never encountered in any economic treatise. The surveyor connected land rights to political philosophy in ways that took my breath away. These men weren't waiting to be taught. They were thinking deeply and originally, but only when given room to do so. I began every inquiry with phrases that became my signature. I imagine, or perhaps it might be, or correct me if I'm wrong. But these weren't just politeness. They were invitations. They said, "This is our conversation, not my sermon. Your thoughts have equal weight here. We're exploring together, not following a map I've already drawn." The junto became the most influential gathering in Philadelphia, though we were just a dozen tradesmen in a rented room. Ideas born in those smoke-filled evenings became hospitals, libraries, fire companies, and universities. Not because I commanded them into being, but because we reasoned them into being together. The library, in particular, taught me something precious about human nature. When I first proposed it in 1731, I made the mistake of presenting it as Times my Times idea. I proposed to establish a library, I announced with considerable pride. The response was tepid, suspicious even. Who was this ambitious printer trying to make a name for himself? So I withdrew and approached it differently. The next time, I said, "Several gentlemen have expressed interest in pooling their resources to purchase books. I thought perhaps we might formalize this arrangement." The very same men who had resisted now claimed credit for conceiving the idea themselves. And you know what? I let them. The Library Company of Philadelphia was chartered within months. I learned to write always as times when I could write as times I asterisk. To say, it has been observed, rather than, I have observed. To hide my authorship behind Poor Richard, behind Silence Dogood, behind a dozen invented voices that allowed the ideas themselves to shine without the shadow of my ambition falling across them. Vanity is a strange companion. It whispers that we must receive credit for our contributions, that recognition is our due, that history should know our name, and perhaps there is some small truth there. We are, after all, human. But I discovered that vanity satisfied brings fleeting pleasure, while vanity denied brings lasting results. The library succeeded precisely because I surrendered my claim to it. This became my method in everything. When I proposed street lighting for Philadelphia, I began with a single lamp outside my own door, well-maintained and bright. I said nothing, proposed nothing. Within weeks, neighbors inquired where I had purchased it. Within months, the city council was debating a lighting program. The idea spread because it demonstrated itself, not because I championed it. When I organized the first subscription fire company, the Union Fire Company, I made certain that 12 other men signed the charter before I did. My name appeared in the middle of the list. Unremarkable. Within a year, 5 other fire companies formed across Philadelphia, each imagining itself in friendly competition with ours. Within 5 years, the city had transformed from a place where neighbors watched helplessly as flames consumed entire blocks to a community that could respond to fire within minutes. I had not commanded this transformation. I had merely created conditions where transformation became inevitable. The principle applies equally to opposition. When I needed to win over an adversary, I never argued. Instead, I asked to borrow a rare book from his library, a book I knew he prized. When I returned it promptly with a note of sincere gratitude, his disposition toward me shifted entirely. He had performed an act of generosity, which obliged him to reconcile his self-image with his previous hostility toward me. People must convince themselves. I had simply provided the opportunity. This became my method in the assembly, in diplomacy, in every negotiation where stakes exceeded pride. I trained myself to speak in terms of possibility rather than certainty. I imagine this might work, instead of, this will work. Perhaps we could consider, instead of, we must do. This was not weakness, disguised as courtesy. It was a strategy disguised as humility. The art lies in understanding that humans despise being changed but adore the sensation of changing themselves. A direct challenge to someone's position makes them defensive, calcified. But present and adjacent idea suggest a parallel consideration, illuminate a consequence they had not examined. Suddenly they arrive at your conclusion as though it were their own discovery. And perhaps, in the truest sense, it is. You have not changed their mind. You have created conditions where their mind changed. I employed this in matters both trivial and tremendous. When colonial representatives could not agree on a unified defense plan, I did not lecture them on unity. I presented them with a cartoon, a snake severed into segments, each labeled with a colony's name, beneath the words, join or die. I made no argument. The image argued for me, and they could not escape its logic without feeling the fool. The cartoon spread through the colonies faster than any proclamation could have traveled. Men who would have argued for hours against a written proposal found themselves unable to dispute a simple drawing. This is the essence of strategic communication. You do not merely present truth, you present it in a form that makes opposition feel absurd. I learned this technique not from politics but from observation of human nature itself. Watch a skilled tradesman explain his craft to an apprentice. He does not begin with theory. He places a tool in the young man's hand and guides it through the motion. The body learns what the mind might resist. Similarly, I learned to place ideas into forms people could grasp without intellectual strain. Consider my experiments with electricity, another arena where communication determined whether knowledge would spread or die. I could have published my findings in the dense Latin favored by European academicians, filled with lengthy technical formulations that only a handful of scholars might penetrate. Instead, I wrote in plain English, using analogies drawn from everyday experience. I compared the electrical charge to water flowing between containers. I described positive and negative as nothing more mysterious than surplus and deficit. I made the invisible visible through comparison to what any merchant or farmer already understood. The result? My papers on electricity circulated not merely among natural philosophers but among curious citizens across 2 continents. I received letters from London shopkeepers and country parsons who had begun conducting their own experiments. I had democratized knowledge by refusing to hide it behind unnecessary complexity. This same principle guided everything I published in Poor Richard's Almanac. For 25 years, I filled those pages not with elaborate essays but with proverbs short enough to remember, practical enough to use. A penny saved is a penny earned, taught economics more effectively than any treatise on capital accumulation. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, communicated a philosophy of self-discipline without a single mention of virtue theory. Some of my educated contemporaries dismissed these sayings as simplistic. They failed to understand that simplicity is not the opposite of sophistication, it is sophistication's highest achievement. The truly wise communicator meets people where they stand, not where the speaker wishes them to be. I discovered this truth most vividly during my years publishing Poor Richard's Almanac. The almanac was not merely a calendar with weather predictions, it was a delivery system for ideas into homes that might never open a philosophy text. A farmer planning his planting season would encounter wisdom alongside moon phases. A merchant checking tide tables would find financial counsel embedded in the margins. The medium became invisible, the message became inevitable. This is the art of the Trojan horse packaging transformation inside utility. Consider how I approached the complex matter of colonial unity. For decades, I could have published treatises on the constitutional necessity of intercolonial cooperation. I could have cited Locke and Montesquieu until my readers' eyes glazed over. Instead, I drew a snake severed into segments with the caption, "Join or Die." That single image accomplished more than 1,000 pages of political philosophy ever could. It bypassed intellectual gatekeepers and spoke directly to the survival instinct. The message was not simplified, it was concentrated. Like reducing maple sap to syrup, I removed everything that diluted the essence. But here lies the delicate balance. Simplicity without substance becomes manipulation. The creator of viral content bears a profound responsibility. We must ask ourselves constantly, am I simplifying to illuminate, or am I oversimplifying to deceive? Am I removing obstacles to understanding, or am I removing nuance that matters? I witnessed the dark side of this power during the pre-revolutionary period. Propagandists on both sides reduced complex political realities to caricatures. The British depicted colonists as ungrateful children. Colonial firebrands portrayed every British official as a tyrant. Both wielded the tools of simplicity and emotional resonance I had pioneered, but they wielded them without integrity. This taught me a crucial distinction. Viral content succeeds through emotional resonance and simplicity, but lasting time's impact requires those elements to be married to truth. I found myself in an impossible position. I had created weapons of persuasion so powerful that they could be turned against everything I believed in. The printing press doesn't discriminate between truth and lies, it amplifies whatever you feed it. And in 1774, as I sat in London watching the empire I'd tried to preserve crumbling around me, I realized that viral success without a moral foundation is just noise that eventually consumes itself. The breaking point came with the Hutchinson Letters affair. I had leaked private correspondence from Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson to prove that some of our difficulties stemmed from bad advice given to the Crown by colonials themselves. I thought I was serving truth. But the scandal that erupted, the duel it provoked, the public humiliation I endured before the Privy Council taught me that even truth can become a weapon that wounds the wielder when the audience isn't ready to receive it. Lord Wedderburn spent an hour eviscerating me before the council, calling me a thief and a liar, while I stood silent in my spotted velvet suit. The aristocrats laughed. The story spread through every London coffeehouse by evening. I had become the villain in a narrative I no longer controlled. That's when I understood. Once your content enters the wild, it develops a life independent of your intentions. The audience doesn't just consume it, they remake it, reinterpret it, weaponize it according to their own needs. I sailed back to Philadelphia in March 1775. By April, shots had been fired at Lexington. The conversation was over. Now came the part I had dreaded but could no longer avoid. Turning all my knowledge of persuasion, all my understanding of how stories spread and audiences respond, toward a single purpose: convincing Americans that independence wasn't just possible but necessary. Here's what made this different from anything I'd done before. I wasn't trying to go viral for profit or fame. I was trying to birth a nation. The stakes were existential. Get it wrong, and we'd all hang as traitors. The content strategy had to be flawless. And flawless content requires understanding your distribution channels with surgical precision. In 1776, we had three primary channels: the printed pamphlet, the public square, and the tavern. Each demanded different content strategies. A pamphlet could be dense, philosophical, and packed with reasoned arguments because people read them privately, at their own pace. But a speech in the public square? That needed to be punchy, memorable, and built for vocal delivery. And tavern talk, that was where the real persuasion happened, friend to friend, over ale and bread. We optimized for each channel differently. Common Sense worked as a pamphlet because Paine understood the medium. He didn't write like a scholar addressing other scholars. He wrote like a friend explaining something obvious that everyone had somehow missed. The tone was conversational but urgent. The arguments are built like steps, each one leading naturally to the next. And crucially, it was priced to spread just 2 shillings. Paine and I discussed this at length. Price it too high, and only the wealthy read it. Price it low enough, and it becomes viral. That's a distribution strategy. The content itself must be shaped by how it will travel. I optimize the declaration for oral delivery as much as for written reading. Jefferson's prose sings when read aloud. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Try saying that out loud right now. Feel how the words flow? The rhythm? That's intentional. The declaration was read from courthouse steps, from pulpits, in town squares across 13 colonies. It had to work as a performance. Today, you have more channels than I could have dreamed possible. Video, audio, text, images, each on multiple platforms with different algorithms, different audience expectations. YouTube isn't TikTok. LinkedIn isn't Instagram. A script that works as a video essay won't work as a Twitter thread. But here's what hasn't changed. Your content must be native to its channel. I see creators making this mistake constantly. They create content for one platform and just dump it everywhere else without adaptation. That's like taking a tavern conversation and printing it verbatim as a legal document. Wrong medium, wrong format, wrong tone. Study your channels like I studied the printing press. Understand not just the technical specifications but the psychology of how people consume content there. YouTube viewers give you more time but demand engagement every few seconds. They'll tolerate longer setups if you earn their trust, but lose them once and they're gone. The algorithm isn't your enemy, it's your printing press. Learn how it works. Optimize for it. But never let it dictate your message, only how you deliver it. The algorithm is merely the printing press. What matters is what you print upon it. Now, the 6th principle, ***, embrace criticism as the anvil, upon which truth is forged, ***. When I published under the name Silence Dogood, the responses were colorful. Some praised the wit. Others called me a scoundrel, a troublemaker, an upstart who ought to mind his station. The criticism stung, I won't lie. But here's what I learned. Every piece of criticism, no matter how harsh, contains at least a grain of truth worth examining. The modern creator faces criticism amplified 1,000-fold. Comments, quote tweets, reaction videos, entire forums dedicated to dissecting your every word. The temptation is to either build walls, disable comments, hide replies, retreat into an echo chamber, or to lash out, to defend every syllable as if your honor depends on it. Both responses are failures of character. I developed a practice I called the cooling period. When someone criticized my work, I would read their words, feel whatever emotion arose, anger, hurt, indignation, and then set it aside for 24 hours. The next day, I would return with a cooler head and ask, is there any validity here? Any perspective I haven't considered? 9 times out of 10, I found something valuable. Perhaps my argument had been unclear. Perhaps I had overlooked a consequence. Perhaps my tone had been unnecessarily harsh. The critic, even the hostile one, had done me a service by highlighting a weakness I could strengthen. Apply this today. When someone criticizes your video, your article, your creation, resist the immediate defensive reaction. Wait, reflect, ask what truth might be buried beneath the hostility. Some criticism is simply malicious, yes, but much of it, even poorly expressed, comes from a place of genuine response to your work. And here's the paradox. The creators who learn to welcome criticism, who demonstrate growth in response to it, earn deeper loyalty than those who project false perfection. Your audience doesn't want an infallible guru. They want a fellow traveler who admits mistakes, adjusts course, and models intellectual humility. Share your learning process. When you get something wrong, acknowledge it. When someone offers a perspective you hadn't considered, credit them. This isn't weakness, it's the ultimate strength. It says, I care more about getting closer to the truth than about protecting my ego. And let me tell you, people notice. They might not always say it aloud, but they feel it. When you acknowledge someone's contribution, you give them something money can't buy. Significance. You tell them their thoughts matter, that they've added value to the world, even if just in that small exchange. I learned this during my years organizing the Junto, our little club of tradesmen and thinkers who met every Friday evening. We had a rule. Anyone could propose an idea, no matter how wild or unpolished. But here's what made it work. We built, into our structure, the habit of recognition. When someone's suggestion led to insight, we acknowledged it explicitly. Friend, your observation about the lending practices has shifted my thinking entirely. Simple words, profound impact. Because here's what happens when you don't give credit. Resentment festers. The other person knows they contributed, they remember. And next time you need their insight, their creativity, their goodwill, gone. You've taught them their ideas will be stolen, not celebrated. You've poisoned the well you'll need to drink from again. I've watched men destroy promising partnerships over this very thing. One takes credit for a shared innovation. The other withdraws, quietly at first, then completely. What could have been a lifetime of collaborative brilliance becomes a cold war of withheld ideas, all because someone couldn't say 3 simple words. You were right. The beautiful irony? When you habitually give credit, people start associating you with good ideas anyway. They see you as someone who attracts wisdom, who synthesizes insights, who makes connections others miss. Your reputation grows, not despite sharing credit, but because of it. Think about the people you most respect. I'd wager they're the ones who say things like, actually, that wasn't my idea. James suggested it, and I just built on it. Or, Sarah saw this problem coming months ago. They're secure enough not to need all the glory. And paradoxically, they end up with more influence than those desperately hoarding every scrap of recognition. This isn't just about being nice. It's strategic wisdom. You're building a network of people who trust you, who want to share their best thinking with you, and who know their contributions will be honored. You're creating an environment where ideas flow freely because everyone knows the rules are fair. You want to be someone people seek out when they have an idea. You want to be the person they trust with their half-formed thoughts, their experimental concepts, their breakthrough innovations. That only happens when you've proven yourself to be someone who gives credit where it's due. I've seen the alternative, and it's intellectually lonely. Some people are so eager to claim every idea as their own that eventually, no one shares anything meaningful with them anymore. They're excluded from the most interesting conversations. They're left out of collaborative projects. They wonder why no one invites them to the table anymore, never realizing they burned those bridges themselves. The most fertile intellectual environments I've ever been part of, the Junto, the Royal Society meetings, my correspondence networks across continents, they all had this foundation of mutual respect and proper attribution. We pushed each other further because we trusted each other. Here's something else that happens when you make this a habit. You develop a reputation that opens doors. People I'd never met would write to me because they'd heard I was someone who valued ideas over ego. Scientists would share their findings. Inventors would ask for feedback. Political thinkers would test their arguments with me. Why? Because word had spread that I was a safe harbor for intellectual exchange. That reputation became more valuable than any individual idea I could have stolen. It gave me access to the collective intelligence of some of the brightest minds of my era. I wasn't just drawing from my own well, I was connected to an entire aquifer of human thought. And here's the paradox. The more credit I gave away, the more I received. Not because I was scheming for it, but because when you're genuinely helpful, when you elevate others' work, when you facilitate connections and give proper attribution, people remember. They speak well of you. They recommend you. They want to collaborate with you. I became known as a connector, a facilitator, someone who made things happen. That wasn't because I was the smartest person in any room, I rarely was. It was because I understood that my role was to help good ideas find their full expression, regardless of whose name would ultimately be attached to them. Let me tell you about one more principle that guided me. I never viewed an idea as fully mine until I'd tested it, refined it, and made it useful. I called this instrumental virtue, the practice of making ideas work in the real world, not just sound clever in conversation. Too many people fell in love with the elegance of their theories without bothering to see if those theories actually solved problems. I saw this constantly in the philosophical societies of Philadelphia and London. Brilliant men would construct elaborate arguments about how society should function, but they'd never roll up their sleeves to actually organize a community project. When I proposed the idea of a lending library, I didn't just write a beautiful essay about the theoretical benefits of shared knowledge. I worked out the subscription model, calculated the costs, identified which books would be most useful, and figured out how to make members feel ownership without any single person controlling the collection. The theory was simple: pool resources to access more books. But the implementation? That required answering 100 practical questions that no philosophical treatise would address. You see, an idea untested is just an entertaining thought. An idea tested but not refined is just a failed experiment. But an idea tested, refined, and made useful? That becomes something that can change the world long after you're gone. I tested everything. My printing techniques, my diplomatic approaches, even my methods for self-improvement. That famous chart I kept, tracking my progress on 13 virtues, that wasn't me being obsessive. That was me recognizing that be more humble sounds nice but means nothing without a system to practice it. The funny thing about making ideas useful is that it requires a special kind of humility. The humility to accept that your brilliant insight might need to be completely transformed before it actually helps anyone. I learned this most powerfully through my experiments with electricity. My initial theories about electrical fire and positive and negative charges, they were interesting, but they weren't useful until I figured out how to harness that knowledge to protect buildings from lightning strikes. The lightning rod didn't emerge from pure theory. It emerged from watching houses burn, from talking to ship captains about masts shattered by storms, from the practical question, how do we stop this destruction? That practical application made the knowledge matter. It saved lives, protected property, and turned abstract understanding into concrete benefit. And here's what I noticed. Something that applies whether you're working with electricity or establishing a new nation. The most powerful innovations come when you combine theoretical understanding with practical constraints. Theory without application remains sterile. An application without theory becomes mere trial and error, inefficient, and limited. When I organized the first subscription library in America, I wasn't just thinking about books on shelves. I was thinking about tradesmen and merchants who wanted to improve themselves but couldn't afford personal libraries. I was thinking about how knowledge sharing creates compound returns for a community. One person reads a book on agriculture, improves their farm, and shares that knowledge with neighbors. The benefit multiplies. The practical structure, the subscription model, the borrowing rules, these weren't afterthoughts. They were essential to making the theoretical value of shared knowledge actually work in the real world. You need both the vision and the mechanism. This is perhaps my greatest frustration with how people approach problems today. They separate thinking from doing, strategy from execution, as if these were different activities requiring different people. But the most effective solutions come from minds that can move fluidly between the abstract and the concrete, between the what-if and the how-to. When we were designing the Constitution, we couldn't just theorize about balanced government. We had to account for how laws would actually be enforced, how representatives would actually be elected, and how conflicts between states would actually be resolved. Every lofty principle had to be connected to a practical mechanism, or it was just words on paper. The same principle applies to every area of life. You want to be healthier? Don't just commit to being healthy. Define what that means in actionable terms. Is it walking for 30 minutes every day? Is it preparing 3 home-cooked meals a week? Is it going to bed before midnight? Each of these creates a bridge between intention and reality. Do you want to improve your relationships? Vague resolutions about being a better friend accomplish nothing. But committing to call one friend every Sunday, or to write a letter once a month, or to organize a gathering every quarter, these are mechanisms that transform goodwill into genuine connection. I've watched people make grand New Year's resolutions that collapse by February. And I've watched others make quiet, specific commitments that compound into transformed lives. The difference is never in the intensity of desire. It's in the quality of the mechanism. This is why I was so insistent on including specific procedures in the Constitution. How many senators per state? 2. How long is a presidential term? 4 years. How does impeachment work? The House charges, the Senate tries. What's the threshold for overriding a veto? 2/3 of both chambers. These weren't pedantic details. They were the load-bearing structures of the entire system. Without them, every beautiful principle would have dissolved into confusion and conflict the moment someone tried to apply it. Think about marriage. Everyone enters it with beautiful intentions, love, partnership, mutual support. But the marriages that endure aren't the ones with the strongest initial feelings. They're the ones that develop mechanisms, weekly date nights, daily check-ins, shared responsibility systems, and conflict resolution practices. The feeling of love provides the why. The mechanisms provide the how. Or consider learning a new skill. Wanting to play piano is lovely. But wanting becomes doing only when you establish a mechanism. Practicing scales for 15 minutes every morning, scheduling weekly lessons, setting monthly performance goals for yourself. The mechanism doesn't diminish the passion, it channels it into reality. I've seen too many brilliant ideas die because no one thought about implementation. Revolutionary inventions that no one could manufacture. Brilliant businesses that couldn't get products to customers. Profound philosophies that offered no guidance for daily living. The graveyard of human potential is filled not with bad ideas, but with good ideas that lacked mechanisms for execution. When I organized the first lending library in America, the principle was simple. Knowledge should be accessible to all, not just the wealthy. But the principle alone would have changed nothing. We needed mechanisms. We needed a building where the books could be housed. We needed rules for borrowing and returning. We needed a method for acquiring new volumes, for maintaining the collection, and for resolving disputes when someone kept a book too long. We needed, in short, a system that would allow the principle to breathe and move in the real world. This is where so many well-intentioned efforts collapse. The founder has passion and vision, but they neglect the unglamorous work of building the machinery that translates vision into reality. They assume good intentions will be enough. They won't. I spent countless hours on what others might consider trivial details. How much should membership cost? Too high, and we exclude the very people we seek to serve. Too low, and we cannot sustain the operation. What penalties for damaged books? What process is used for selecting new acquisitions? Should we allow members to suggest titles, or maintain sole discretion? Each question seemed small, but each answer shaped whether our library would thrive or wither. The subscription model we developed became a template copied across the colonies. Members paid an initial fee and annual dues. In return, they gained access to volumes they could never afford individually. The beauty was in the mechanism itself. It aligned individual self-interest with collective benefit. You paid not out of charity, but because you wanted access to knowledge. Yet your payment also ensured that others could access that same knowledge. Enlightened self-interest, properly structured. When I established the Union Fire Company, I applied the same thinking. Philadelphia had burned before and would burn again. Everyone agreed fires were terrible, but agreement prevents no fires. We needed trained volunteers who knew how to work together. We needed equipment buckets, hooks, ladders stored in accessible locations. We needed protocols for who would do what when flames erupted. More importantly, we needed incentive structures that would ensure commitment over time. Enthusiasm fades. The fireman who eagerly joins in September may find excuses in January's cold. So we built in social accountability. Members who missed meetings without cause paid fines. We held regular drills, turning firefighting from an abstract duty into a practice skill. We created bonds among members, so that responding to a fire meant not just fulfilling an obligation but supporting friends. The Union Fire Company became more than an organization, it became a culture. We didn't just wait for fires to happen. We walked the streets with new eyes, noting which buildings had wooden shingles that needed replacing, which chimneys leaked smoke through cracked mortar, which alleys had accumulated the kind of debris that invited disaster. We began conversations with merchants and homeowners, not as authorities imposing rules, but as neighbors sharing concern. I remember one shopkeeper, a stubborn Dutchman named Van der Berg, who dismissed our warnings about the oily rags he kept piled near his forge. "I've worked this way for 30 years, he told me, his arms crossed like fortress walls. Rather than argue, I invited him to our next drill. I showed him how quickly flame could travel through fabric soaked in oil. I let him feel the heat that could build in seconds. The following week, he installed a metal container with a sealed lid for his rags. He never admitted I was right, but his shop never burned either. This was the multiplication of wisdom I had sought. Each member of the Union Fire Company carried knowledge into their own circles. Each conversation planted seeds. Each near miss that was prevented through vigilance created invisible proof of our methods, the disasters that never happened, the families who never mourned, the businesses that continued because catastrophe had been forestalled. Yet, I understood that private action alone could never fully solve a public problem. Fire companies could respond, could prepare, could educate, but they operated within a larger framework that needed transformation. The city itself needed to change how it thought about fire, how it built, and how it planned. This realization led me to a new frontier, the intersection of civic organization and governmental policy. If I had learned anything from years of community building, it was that lasting change required both grassroots initiative and institutional support. The question was how to bridge that gap, how to translate the lessons learned by voluntary associations into public action. The answer came through persistence and strategy. I began attending town meetings, not to grandstand but to listen. I identified which officials genuinely cared about public safety versus those who merely paid lip service. I learned which arguments moved people, not abstract appeals to duty, but concrete examples of costs saved, lives preserved, property protected. Within 6 months, I had cultivated relationships with 3 council members, 4 prominent merchants, and the printer who published meeting minutes. I didn't approach these conversations as transactions. I approached them as apprenticeships in understanding what mattered to Philadelphia beyond my own perspective. The turning point came during a particularly brutal winter when a warehouse fire spread to 3 adjacent buildings, destroying inventory worth thousands of pounds. The owner, a respected textile merchant, stood in the ashes and wept openly. I attended the scene not as a journalist seeking a story, but as a neighbor bearing witness. At the next town meeting, I didn't launch into my rehearsed speech about fire companies. Instead, I asked a question. How many of us can afford to lose everything we've built in a single night? The room fell silent. I've been studying fire prevention methods used in Boston and London. I'd like to organize a group of citizens willing to keep leather buckets, ladders, and hooks in our homes' neighbors who'll respond when fire strikes. Not for profit, not for glory, simply because we're more likely to save our livelihoods together than alone. I didn't demand they adopt my plan. I invited them into a shared problem. 3 men approached me after the meeting. Within 2 weeks, we had 15 volunteers. Within a month, the Union Fire Company held its first official gathering. We established simple protocols: who would respond to which alarms, where equipment would be stored, and how we'd coordinate with other emerging fire companies. The brilliance wasn't in the innovation bucket brigades had existed for centuries. The brilliance was in the timing, the framing, and the foundation of trust I'd built through months of unglamorous listening. This is what most people miss when they study influence. They see the public moment, the successful proposal, the cheering crowd, the policy change, and assume that's where power resides. They don't see the 60 conversations that preceded it. The relationships are cultivated without an immediate agenda. The credibility earned through a consistent, humble presence. You don't gain influence by announcing your worthiness. You gain it by making others feel heard, valued, and part of something meaningful. And here's what surprises most people: this approach works faster than aggressive self-promotion. When you're constantly selling yourself, people's defenses go up. They scroll past. They tune out. They wait for you to finish talking so they can leave. But when you show up to genuinely contribute, when you ask thoughtful questions, when you celebrate others' wins without mentioning your own people, lean in. I've watched creators spend months shouting into the void, wondering why nobody's listening. Then they shift their energy. They start commenting meaningfully on 10 posts before posting their own. They share someone else's work with genuine enthusiasm. They ask their audience what they're struggling with, instead of assuming they know. Within weeks, the landscape changes. Not because the algorithm suddenly favored them, but because humans suddenly saw them. This is how movements begin, you know. Not with manifestos, but with conversations. Not with declarations, but with invitations. You create a space where people feel safe enough to contribute their own thoughts, their own experiences. You respond to every comment in those early days not with generic thanks, but with real engagement. You remember what people tell you. You follow up. You make them feel that their participation matters, because it does. I built networks across colonies not by telling people I was important, but by being genuinely curious about their ideas. The electricity experiments? I shared every discovery freely, invited collaboration, and credited others generously. And yes, some took advantage. Some took credit they didn't earn. But the majority? They became advocates, collaborators, and amplifiers of the work. The network grew stronger because it wasn't about protecting my position, it was about advancing knowledge. Your digital presence works the same way. Every interaction is either a withdrawal or a deposit in your relationship bank. The person who only shows up to promote their latest offer? Withdrawals. The creator who disappears for months, then returns asking for support? Withdrawal. But the person who consistently adds value, who shows up even when they have nothing to sell, who makes their audience feel smart and capable? Deposits. Compound interest on those deposits creates influence that advertising simply cannot buy. I once attended a town meeting where a young printer competed with my own business. He would stand in the square each week, shouting about his prices, his speed, his quality. Every week, the same speech. People walked past. I took a different approach. I published useful information, weather patterns for farmers, tide schedules for merchants, fire safety practices that saved actual homes. I never mentioned my printing services in these publications, but when someone needed a printer, they came to my door. Why? Because I had made deposits into the community account, not transactions, investments in people's well-being that they remembered. This is the content strategy that outlasts every algorithm change, every platform shift, every marketing trend. Value that requires nothing in return creates a bond that transactional content never can. Think of your favorite creators right now. The ones you'd defend in a comment section. The ones whose notifications you actually want to receive. I'll wager they've given you something valuable without asking for anything back. Maybe they taught you a skill, made you laugh during a difficult time, helped you understand yourself better, changed how you see the world. That's not marketing. That's relationship building at scale. And relationships built on genuine value withstand storms that wash away everything else. The creator who stops posting the moment their course launch ends? Withdrawal. The creator who only appears when they need something from you? Withdrawal. The creator who treats their audience like an ATM? You're not building a bank account, you're creating debt. And here's what the short-term thinkers miss. Those deposits don't just create goodwill. They create something far more valuable in the attention economy. They create patience. Your audience will wait for you when you need a break. They'll give you the benefit of the doubt when you experiment with something new. They'll forgive mistakes because the relationship account is so full that one withdrawal barely registers. This is why creators who chase virality without building relationship equity eventually hit a wall. They're constantly starting from zero with each video, always hunting for the next lucky break, the next algorithmic blessing. Meanwhile, relationship-focused creators build momentum that compounds over time. I learned this lesson not just through Poor Richard's Almanac, but through decades of letter writing. Every letter I wrote to a friend, colleague, or fellow scientist was an investment. When I needed support for the Postal Service, for my experiments, for political causes, those relationships paid dividends I could never have anticipated. Here's what relationship equity looks like in practice. A creator I studied took 3 months off for mental health. When they returned, their first video back didn't just match their average views, it exceeded them by 40%. Their audience had been waiting, checking back, genuinely hoping they were okay. That's not metrics. That's community. Another creator made a video about a personal struggle completely unrelated to their usual content. It should have tanked by all conventional wisdom. Instead, it became their most watched video of the year because their audience cared about them as a person, not just as a content machine. This is the difference between being a channel and being a presence in people's lives. Channels can be replaced. Presences leave a hole when they're gone. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you focus on building relationships, instead of optimizing for algorithms, the algorithms eventually reward you anyway. Because the signals of genuine relationship watch time, repeat viewers, genuine engagement, community interaction are exactly what platforms are trying to measure. You can't fake these signals at scale. Not sustainably. The algorithm is ultimately trying to identify content that creates a real human connection because that's what keeps people on the platform. When you build actual relationships, you're giving the algorithm exactly what it's searching for, but you're doing it as a side effect of something far more valuable. Think of it this way. The algorithm is a metal detector, sweeping the beach looking for gold. Most creators are trying to fool the detector with clever pieces of foil. But when you build real relationships, you're actually creating gold. The detector finds you eventually, but even if it doesn't, you're still holding something precious. Most people miss the subtle truth here. They think building a genuine channel is the harder path, and in some ways, it is. Real relationships require vulnerability. They demand consistency. You can't fake caring about your audience for months at a time. But here's what I learned through decades of publishing Poor Richard's Almanac. The hard path becomes easy, and the easy path becomes hard. The channel built on tricks exhausts you. Every algorithm change sends you scrambling. Every new platform feature requires reinvention. You're constantly anxious about being exposed, about losing everything overnight. The mental toll is enormous. Meanwhile, the creator who invested in relationships, they sleep soundly. Their audience follows them anywhere. Algorithm shifts barely register. They've built something resilient because they've built it on the one foundation that never changes: human connection. I saw this pattern in Philadelphia's merchant community. The traders who built success on deception and sharp dealing, they made quick money, certainly, but they aged rapidly. The constant stress of maintaining their web of lies wore them down. They trusted no one because they themselves were untrustworthy. The honest merchants, though, grew old with grace. Their reputation was their retirement plan. They could step back from daily operations because their name meant something. Their relationships continued generating opportunities long after they'd stopped actively seeking them. YouTube works the same way. The trick-based channel is a prison. You're trapped endlessly, creating content that game the system, terrified of the day it stops working. And it always stops working. The relationship-based channel is freedom. You're creating content that matters to real people. When one approach stops performing, your audience tells you what they need instead. You're not guessing at algorithms, you're responding to humans. This is why I always counseled young printers to focus on quality and reliability rather than undercutting prices. The cheapest bid wins today's contract. The best reputation wins every contract for the next 20 years. Your channel isn't just about this video or this month's analytics. It's about building an asset that compounds over time. Every genuine subscriber is like a small investment that pays dividends forever. Every manipulated subscriber is like a counterfeit coin, looks valuable until someone actually tries to spend it. The question isn't whether you can fool the detector. The question is, what are you building? Are you constructing a house of cards that requires perfect conditions to stay standing? Or are you laying bricks for something that will outlast you? Let me tell you about a young man I met years ago, bright, ambitious, full of fire. He'd read all the right books, attended all the right seminars, and surrounded himself with ambitious peers who spoke endlessly about their goals. He had vision boards, morning routines, accountability partners, the complete arsenal of modern success mythology. And he failed spectacularly. Not because his methods were wrong. Not because he lacked intelligence or work ethic. He failed because he'd built his entire identity on the outcome rather than the process. When the market shifted, when his first venture collapsed, when reality refused to cooperate with his carefully constructed vision, he had nothing to fall back on. No foundation, no reserves. Just a beautiful facade that crumbled at the first real test. Compare that to another person I knew didn't read the business books, never attended the seminars, wouldn't recognize a vision board if it hit him in the face. But every single day, without fail, he showed up, put in the work, made small improvements, built relationships based on genuine service rather than strategic networking. When challenges came, and they always come, he had something solid beneath him, something real. The difference wasn't talent, it wasn't luck, it was understanding this fundamental truth. Success isn't a destination you arrive at after following the right formula. It's a byproduct of becoming someone capable of creating and sustaining value over time. Think about every meaningful achievement in your life. Not the things you were given or the lucky breaks, the things you actually built. I guarantee that none of them came from simply following someone else's blueprint. They came from the messy, uncomfortable process of figuring things out yourself, of failing, adjusting, and persisting, of developing capabilities that no book could fully teach you. This is why mentorship works when it does, not because the mentor hands you a formula, but because they've walked through that wilderness and can help you avoid the most catastrophic mistakes while still letting you do the essential work of becoming capable. The gurus don't tell you this because there's no course they can sell on. Become more capable over time through sustained effort and intelligent persistence. There's no seven-figure mastermind for develop genuine competence in something valuable. These truths don't scale. They can't be packaged. They require actual transformation rather than information consumption. So here's what I'm asking you to consider. What if everything you've been taught about achievement is backwards? What if the path to extraordinary results doesn't run through more effort, but through complete redirection of effort? I'm watching people climb mountains with tremendous dedication, sweat pouring down their faces, muscles burning, convinced that their suffering proves their commitment. And I want to tell them you're on the wrong mountain. Your effort is real, your dedication is genuine, but you're climbing toward a summit that won't give you what you actually want. This is the hidden tragedy of modern achievement culture. We've created entire industries around helping people climb faster, grip harder, and push through pain more effectively. But almost nobody stops to ask, is this the mountain that leads where you actually want to go? I see this most clearly in how people approach skill development. They identify a skill they admire, public speaking, let's say, and they immediately ask, how do I get better at this? They buy courses. They practice techniques. They force themselves onto stages despite crippling anxiety, and some of them do improve. They learn to control their shaking hands. They memorize frameworks for structuring talks. They push through the fear with sheer willpower. But here's what they miss. The people they admire, the speakers who seem effortlessly magnetic, aren't doing any of that. They're not managing anxiety or applying frameworks. They've developed a completely different relationship with communication itself. The amateur speaker is thinking, how do I hide my nervousness? How do I remember my points? How do I keep their attention? The master speaker isn't thinking about themselves at all. They're entirely focused on the transformation they're creating in the room. Their technique emerges naturally from that focus. This is what I mean by wrong mountain. You can spend years getting better at managing speaking anxiety, or you can spend that time developing such a deep connection to your message that anxiety becomes irrelevant. Same effort, completely different mountain, radically different destination. And here's what nobody tells you about wasting effort on the wrong mountain. Asterisk, asterisk. You don't just lose the time you spent climbing. You lose the compound returns you could have been building on the right one. Asterisk, asterisk. Let me show you what I mean. Two entrepreneurs. Both wake up at 5 a.m. Both work 12-hour days. Both sacrifice weekends. First one? He's building a product in a dying market because he's too stubborn to pivot. He's convinced that if he just works harder, grinds longer, the market will eventually see his vision. 3 years in, he's exhausted, broke, and bitter. The market wasn't ready, he tells himself. But the truth? The market was never going to be ready. He climbed with impressive determination. Just climbed the wrong mountain entirely. Second entrepreneur? She spent her first 3 months just researching which mountain to climb. Talked to hundreds of potential customers. Tested 20 different ideas with minimal investment. Found the one that had real demand, real willingness to pay, real scalability. Then and only then did she start the serious climb. Same work ethic as the first entrepreneur. But 3 years later, she's scaled to 8 figures because every ounce of effort compounds on itself. Same sacrifice, radically different outcomes. And this is where most motivational content absolutely fails you. It tells you to dream bigger, work harder, never give up, but it never asks the fundamental question. Asterisk, asterisk. Are you pointed at something worth reaching? Asterisk, asterisk. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Persistence on the wrong path isn't a virtue. It's a tragedy. I see this all the time in relationships too. Someone's in a partnership that's fundamentally misaligned. Different values, different visions, different definitions of what a good life looks like. But they keep trying. They read the books. They go to therapy. They convince themselves that if they just communicate better or try harder, everything will work out. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is admit you're climbing incompatible mountains and let each other find the right peak. This isn't about quitting. This isn't about lack of commitment. This is about having the wisdom to recognize when your ladder is against the wrong wall entirely. I've watched countless individuals paralyze themselves with this notion that they must finish what they started, as if the universe is keeping a scoreboard of abandoned ventures. They stay in doctoral programs that drain their soul because they've already invested 3 years. They continue writing books that no longer speak to their hearts because they've already written 40,000 words. They remain in business partnerships that have become toxic because they shook hands on it 5 years ago. But here's what I learned in my own wanderings, through print shops, scientific laboratories, political chambers, and diplomatic halls. The path to wisdom is littered with abandoned experiments. Not every hypothesis deserves a conclusion. Not every beginning deserves an ending. I started as a candlemaker's apprentice, my father's plan for my future. I left that behind. I apprenticed as a printer under my brother James, but that relationship grew contentious, and I broke my indentures. Some would call that quitting. I call it redirection. Had I remained bound by those early commitments simply because I'd started them, you wouldn't know my name today. The mental trap here is confusing commitment with stubbornness. True commitment is to your growth, your purpose, your highest contribution, not to a specific vehicle you once chose to carry you there. When that vehicle breaks down or heads in the wrong direction, you don't commit to staying in it. You commit to finding a better one. I knew individuals in Philadelphia who spent decades perfecting inventions that the world didn't need, simply because they'd already spent years on them. The sunk cost, the time already invested, became a prison. They couldn't see that every additional day was a fresh choice, not an obligation created by yesterday's choices. You must ask yourself regularly, if I were starting fresh today, knowing what I now know, would I choose this path? If the answer is no, then you've just discovered you're living someone else's decision, your past self's decision, made with inferior information. The most dangerous part of this trap is how it disguises itself as virtue. We call it commitment. We call it perseverance. We call it loyalty. And sometimes, those labels fit. But other times, they're just elaborate costumes for fear. I've watched people stay in businesses that were clearly failing, not because they believed in the mission anymore, but because admitting failure felt like admitting they'd wasted years. I've seen marriages continue long after love departed, because neither person wanted to confess that the investment hadn't paid off. The relationship became a business contract, evaluated purely on past expenditures rather than future happiness. This is where we must distinguish between two very different types of persistence. There's the persistence born from vision, when you can still see the destination clearly and you're willing to endure temporary setbacks to reach it. That's noble. That's necessary. But then there's the persistence born from paralysis, when you can no longer remember why you started, when the destination has vanished into fog, but you keep walking because turning around would mean admitting you've been walking in circles. The sunk cost fallacy thrives in that fog. It whispers that the only way to redeem your past investments is to invest more. It promises that just beyond the next hill, everything will make sense. But here's what I learned from my many experiments, both successful and failed. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop. Sometimes, the wisest investment is walking away. Consider this perspective shift that changed how I approached every project in the later years of my life. I began treating time like I treated money in my accounting books. Every morning, I ask myself, if someone offered to pay me to spend today doing exactly what I have planned, would I accept that offer? Would the payment be worth the hours? This simple question cut through years of accumulated obligation. Suddenly, activities I'd been doing for decades revealed themselves as poor investments of my remaining time. I began saying no to things that once seemed mandatory. Committee meetings where I contributed nothing unique. Social gatherings left me drained rather than energized. Projects that excited others but bored me to tears. Each refusal felt like treason at first. I'd been the reliable one, the person who showed up, who said yes, who carried more than my share. What would people think if I suddenly started declining? But here's what actually happened. Very little. A few people expressed mild disappointment. Most simply found someone else. And some, this surprised me, most responded with a knowing nod, as if they'd been waiting for me to figure this out. Good for you, one friend said when I declined yet another volunteer role. I stopped doing that stuff years ago. The space I created by saying no didn't remain empty. It filled naturally with things that actually mattered. Deeper conversations, Creative projects I'd postponed for decades. Quiet mornings without obligation pressing against my chest. I started applying the hourly rate question everywhere. Would I pay someone the equivalent of what my time was worth to do this task? To attend this meeting? To maintain this exhausting relationship? The answers were clarifying, and sometimes brutal. I wouldn't pay someone $300 to sit through a 2-hour meeting that could have been an email. I wouldn't pay someone $500 to maintain a friendship that consisted entirely of complaints and never reciprocated care. I wouldn't pay someone $800 to spend an evening at an event I dreaded attending. Yet I'd been making these payments not with money, but with something far more valuable and far less renewable. Your time has a price, even if no one's paying it directly. Especially then. Because when time flows freely without perceived cost, we spend it like lottery winners, convinced the supply is infinite. It isn't. Every hour you give to something that doesn't warrant the cost is an hour stolen from everything that does. From the book you meant to write. From the child who will be grown before you blink. From the version of yourself you keep promising you'll become when things slow down. Things don't slow down. You do. Eventually. Whether you plan for it or not. The question isn't whether you'll stop someday. The question is whether you'll have stopped for the things that mattered. I've watched countless men and women reach the end of their careers, with wealth, with recognition, with every external marker of success, and with an emptiness they never saw coming. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded at a game that wasn't worth winning in the first place. They spent 3 decades building a company that made other people rich, while their own children grew up calling someone else's parents close friends. They spent weekends working instead of wandering. They spent the holidays catching up instead of creating memories. And when they finally arrived at the finish line they'd been racing toward, they looked around and realized they'd run the race alone. This isn't melodrama. This is mathematics. Your life is a fixed resource. Every hour invested in one area is an hour divested from another. And the brutal truth that nobody wants to acknowledge is that the returns don't compound equally. Working an extra 5 hours this week might increase your annual income by a fraction of a percent, but missing dinner with your family 5 nights in a row? That's a relationship deficit that accrues interest you can never pay back. Those conversations you didn't have, those bedtime stories you didn't read, those quiet moments of connection you postponed, they don't wait in some holding pattern for you to get less busy. They disappear. And here's what makes it particularly insidious. The loss is invisible in the moment. Your daughter doesn't throw a tantrum because you missed another recital. She just stops inviting you to the next one. Your spouse doesn't file for divorce because you worked late again. They just start building a life that doesn't include you at its center. Your friendships don't end with arguments. They fade into annual holiday cards from people who used to know you. The erosion is gradual, silent, and absolutely devastating. I learned this the hard way, which is to say, I learned it the same way most people do, by losing something I couldn't get back. My eldest son and I went years, barely speaking, not because of any great conflict, but because I was always too preoccupied to truly be present. I thought providing was parenting. I thought success was love made visible. I was wrong. My son, William, sided with the British during our revolution. Of all the betrayals I faced in my long life, this cut deepest. We never reconciled. He died estranged from me, and I from him. I would trade every accolade, every discovery, every word of praise for one conversation where I truly listened to what he needed from me as a father. You see, I had convinced myself that my work was so important, so necessary for the greater good, that personal sacrifices were not just acceptable but noble. I told myself my family would understand, that history would vindicate my choices. But there is no historical achievement that can fill the hole left by an absent parent. No invention can replace presence. No legacy that can substitute for love actively given in the moments that matter. I learned this too late. You still have time. The most brilliant thing I ever did was harness electricity. The most foolish was believing that brilliance in one area of life compensated for failure in another. It doesn't. Success is not fungible. You cannot spend career capital to purchase a family connection. If I could speak to my younger self, I would say, Benjamin, the world will survive without one more of your inventions. Your treaties can wait. Your experiments will be there tomorrow. But your son is young only once. Your daughter needs you now, not later. These moments are the only ones that truly matter, and they are slipping through your fingers while you chase immortality in history books. I achieved that immortality. My name is indeed remembered, but on the coldest nights, when I sat alone in my final years, no amount of fame could warm the chill of regret. You have been given a gift. I squandered awareness. While there is still time to change, don't waste it. Don't rationalize. Don't promise yourself you'll balance things later, when the current project is finished, when circumstances are different. Later never comes, my friend. There is only now. I've watched too many brilliant people burn themselves out chasing a finish line that kept moving further away. I've seen marriages crumble while someone was just finishing this one thing. I've seen children grow distant from fathers who were always about to have more time. I've seen bodies break down, ignored and neglected, until they finally staged a rebellion that couldn't be dismissed. The tragedy isn't that these people failed. Most of them succeeded spectacularly by conventional measures. The tragedy is that they climbed mountains of their own making, only to discover the view from the top was hollow. They won games nobody forced them to play, following rules nobody actually required them to follow. You don't have to live this way. You can pursue excellence without sacrificing your humanity. You can achieve ambitious goals without abandoning the people who love you. You can work hard without working yourself into an early grave. But it requires conscious choice, daily choice, hourly choice sometimes. It requires the courage to disappoint people occasionally, the wisdom to recognize that not every opportunity is actually an opportunity for you, the clarity to understand that your most important work isn't always your most urgent work. Your most important work might be showing up for dinner, being present during a conversation, taking a walk with no destination in mind, sleeping when your body begs for rest, creating something purely for the joy of creation, with no thought of productivity or optimization or return on investment. These aren't luxuries. They're not rewards you earn after checking off enough items on your to-do list. They're fundamental requirements for a life well lived. I discovered this too late in some ways, early enough in others. I had seasons of profound imbalance, periods where my work consumed everything. But I also had the great fortune of recognizing, before it was too late, that time with my family was irreplaceable. Those conversations with friends were as important as conversations with diplomats. That sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply being human. The printing press will still be there tomorrow. The experiments can wait. The letters will get written eventually. But this moment, this single, unrepeatable moment, it's happening right now. And once it's gone, no amount of success, no accumulation of achievements, no monument you build will bring it back.